a biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
I don't know whether this is something you do regularly, but oftentimes it's good to sit and reflect. And if you've been a Christian for a long time, there might be all sorts of influences that you can identify as being important in the development that you have as a Christian believer. And some of those take us on to real levels of maturity. Well, someone who has taken a little bit of time to really just think through who the influential people have been in the history of the Christian church that have influenced his growth as a Christian believer. And Bill Muehlenberg is back with us. Bill from Culture Watch. Bill, welcome back to 2020.
Thanks again, Neil.
Hey, Bill, this is a good exercise, isn't it, to say, which authors did I read in my younger Christian years, or maybe it even might be more recent Christian years? What sort of people who are well known as Christian, even you could say iconic figures that have been able to shape Christian faith, what sort of influence have they had on us? You've actually come up with a pretty significant list. Who's at the top?
Well, there's many, obviously, not just for me, but for each listener here, could be a maybe not so well known, your mom or your dad, your neighbor, a good friend, a pastor, a teacher who's had a huge influence on you, either to become a Christian or grow as a Christian. So obviously for each person, there'll be a whole list of people come to mind straight away. I've tried to focus more on, as you say, authors, teachers, Christian leaders. So probably almost all of the ones I've listed have either written books or had a very public profile. I just started in a first piece with 8 of them. I did another piece with 12, so I'm already up to 20. I could keep doing this for the next few months. And I have been a bit limited, as perhaps many of your listeners. I'm an evangelical Protestant, so most of my ones I've listed are evangelical Christians, and most would be more the last century or so at the most. We can go way back to an Augustine or an Aquinas or you name it, but so mostly newer figures, but some of them I try to tie in a bit of my own personal story. 2 of them I can throw out straight away as names that many would know. When I became a Christian, a gal took an interest in me, a Christian gal. She told me about 2 writers that I should know. Intellectually oriented and a reader, so she said, well, you really need to know C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer. So I think either she lent me a book or 2 of each, or I bought my own. And after that, I ended up buying everything I could get by those 2. So that would just be one example of these early figures in my own life that really had an impact on me. And so many more can be mentioned.
It's interesting to call these sorts of names who wrote books, who became quite famous because of their faith. We call them influencers. And today, influencers can be people who are just good looking, or they love to travel and they make it look really good what they're eating at a restaurant, or, standing in front of a sunset. Influencers, but when we talk about those sorts of people like some of the famous authors you've mentioned and we're going to mention, they are influencers because they've gone through sometimes deep issues, even persecution. They've wrestled with truth and fact, and they've been able to be an influence on the growth of the whole church. There's a difference, isn't there, between what we think of as a modern influencer and what these influencers are as Christian leaders?
Yeah, quite right. In fact, I mentioned that in my first piece. Today, as you say, it's often a young, attractive female or a model who's trying to spruik something, trying to sell something. That's not quite the influencer I have in mind, but yeah, these past Christians who have had such a great influence, So I'm happy to call those influencers for myself, and most of your readers or listeners would know the names and probably could say, yeah, amen, these guys really had an impact on me. So again, the list can go on and on. It might be a Charles Spurgeon, the great Baptist preacher, who's still so very popular and influential today. In fact, many of these guys that I list, well, they're no longer alive, but book of Hebrews talks about, I think in chapter 11, those who are dead, yet they still speak, right? They still have this amazing impact so many decades or even centuries later. So whether it's a preacher like Spurgeon or somebody like the great English teacher, preacher, John Stott, you can think of other authors. It might be Chuck Colson, who had an amazing turnaround, right? Coming out of the Watergate scandal, hatchet man in the Nixon administration, ended up going to prison there only to become a Christian, and then eventually starting his own, ministry to prisoners worldwide. So sometimes amazing how God works. He'll take a hardened heart and life like a Colson, get him saved, and then he too, like me, he would be greatly influenced by people like Lewis and Schaeffer. He'd read all their works as well, and he'd go on to write a whole bunch of great important books, not only on the Christian faith, but the culture wars and how we should then live in the light of all the things that are happening. Francis Schaeffer is another one that I always go back to. In fact, I think this week I did another set of quotations from him, right? The great missionary and evangelist and apologist who had this wonderful ministry in the mountains in Switzerland, a lot of people getting saved. So again, he passed away in 1984, but his books are selling just as much today, I would imagine, as back when he was alive. And his ministry continues. In fact, the group he founded, L'Abri Ministries, it's still there in Switzerland. I think there was one here in Australia, there have been some in America. So these are people who had real impact, real influence. And sure, at the end of the day, as I was walking my dog, we're going to give all honor, all glory, all credit to God when we meet him. But God works through people. He raises up individuals to have an impact, to, help see many come into the kingdom, help many lives be transformed. So after our first, million or 2 years thanking God for what he did and thanking Christ, then we can go around and say, hey, Francis Schaeffer, good to finally catch up. Or, Charles Spurgeon, Colson, so many others, and have a chat with them and say, wow, you guys you made a difference in my life. And I want to thank you for being available and letting God use you.
A wonderful opportunity today. Maybe jot down a name or two as you hear those names mentioned of some of these great authors. One of those that you mentioned, and G.K. Chesterton, who wrote an amazing classic book called Orthodoxy. I think you even named that as one of your favourite books, and I only read it just recently, and what an amazing book it is, Bill. Okay. Such clarity, such ability to be able to diagnose the problems of the times and to bring the scriptural dimension in there that silences the enemies and the scoffers and actually puts wonderful truth into the most beautiful context. He is one of your favourites, isn't he?
Now he is, and as I say, most of the ones I feature are Protestants, evangelicals, but Chesterton, he was a Catholic writer, unashamedly, but as you say, wrote so many books, wrote newspaper columns, just was such an influence. Orthodoxy, the book you mentioned, came out in 1908, so that shows roughly when he was alive. But he, in turn, again, right, influenced people like C.S. Lewis and so many others, Chuck Colson and so on. So it's funny how you just piggyback one from another. Chesterton would have been influenced by those who'd gone before. people in turn were influenced by Chesterton, and then we are influenced by them. So it just keeps going and going, where a great man will stand on the shoulders of another great man. So yeah, Chesterton probably is actually my favorite author, and Orthodoxy might be my favorite book. But even though I do have a whole bunch of authors and writers in my 2 articles, there's some that, as far as I know, haven't written any books, right? The late Keith Green, the contemporary Christian music artist who died young. Interesting, when I was writing about him, he was born in the same year I was, long ago, but he certainly didn't live as long, but his music is still so influential. His wife and most of his kids still live, right? 2 of his children died with him and some others on a plane crash long ago. So, and again, part of the questions you ask is, God, why do you allow these things to happen? Why do some Christians die so very young? But we can say that, well, as we say, probably more of an impact people like Keith Green are having right now, maybe than even when they were alive. I think I went to see him at a concert long ago. My wife, when we were in missionaries, got to chat with him briefly in Europe. But yeah, he died way too young, it seems, but God knew what he was doing. And today, so many Christians are still blessed by his music, his ministry. And by the way, one quick other thing, another person I do list is the great revivalist and holiness preacher, Leonard Ravenhill. Now, if you know anything about him or Keith Green, you think, wow, Keith Green, he was so hardcore. He was such a on fire, dynamic, passionate man for Christ. Well, if you know that one of his early mentors was actually Leonard Ravenhill, they were both living in Texas. So the young Keith Green was mentored by Ravenhill. Well, that kind of explains a whole lot. If you know Ravenhill, wow, what an amazing man of God he was. And then you listen to the music of Keith Green and you say, yeah, that makes sense. The one guy had an influence on the other, and on it goes.
Hey, not everybody on your list is dead, has passed on, is a figure of history. You've got a bunch of those who are still kicking on. D.A. Carson, you've got Johnny Erickson Tada, who's actually been a guest on this program. You've got a bunch of those still living, and but lots of them are historic, but some of these are still breathing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. John Piper is another that's still alive that I mentioned. There's quite a few, actually.
Os Guinness is another one you've got written in there.
Yeah. They're all getting a bit old. So part of what I wrote here was the idea that, very soon they will, if they're, they're in their 80s, some almost in their 90s. Eventually they will pass on. So I'm thinking, wow, they're still alive. They're still having an impact, but soon enough, they won't be with us. So again, it got me thinking, well, I'm getting old. I'm alive. Hopefully I can have a bit of an impact, but maybe even when, I'm gone, whether it's some of these recordings, right, you've got up on YouTube and so on, or some of the articles I've done, website and so on, maybe some of that will well and have an influence on others in years to come. So that's kind of the aim we all should have an impact now, neighbors, friends, family, workmates, but maybe have a legacy, have almost a testimony that lives beyond your own lifespan, where people can say, oh, yeah, I once knew that Neil guy. Yeah, he had an impact on me. Or I remember Bill from long ago. So that's kind of the thing we should be working at, not just being influenced by others, but in turn, let's go and influence other people as well. That's, keep the wheel turning, keep it moving. That's what the Christian is called to do. So we not only are discipled by those who are older than us, we in turn can mentor and disciple younger people. So we just keep the thing moving and have an impact.
Well, on 2020, you get to hear so many of the brand new authors, not only the Australian authors, but also authors from around the world who are writing amazing things. But when we start to talk about the influencers who have shaped the lives of those who might be just a little bit older, there's an awful lot of great names in there. And the sorts of things they write about never date, because the way that they reflect on the Word of God, on those principles and those foundations, they don't change. Maybe some of the circumstances change, but those principles of God don't, and so much great wisdom in those sorts of authors that Bill's mentioned today. You might want to check out those lists. He's got a couple of articles he's written this week, some of my chief Christian influencers. Bill Muehlenberg, I'll point listeners to billmuehlenberg.com or simply Google Culture Watch, one word. Thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thanks again, Neil, and thanks for your influence.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.